20 de julio de 1969, sí, me tocó estar frente al televisor, me tocó ser protagonista de un hecho único. Usted a lo mejor lo recuerda, usted comparte conmigo cómo el hombre llegó a la luna. Cómo yo tengo, y por eso es importante que usted vea este pequeño documento que tiene que ver con las dudas, si realmente el hombre llegó a la luna o no. Es una perlita que quería tener con ustedes esta noche. Porque recuerdo a la abuela, sí, a la nona, diciéndome, no llegó el hombre a la luna. No, abuela, ¿cómo que no llegó el hombre a la luna? No, Dady, te digo que no llegó el hombre a la luna. Estoy convencida que no llegó el hombre a la luna. Es una mentira, nos están mintiendo. Abuela, lo vi, el hombre llegó a la luna. Y siempre pensaba en lo que me decía la abuela. Porque era una sospecha que muchos en el mundo siguen teniendo. Nos vendieron un buzón. Es una historia tal vez que oculta en realidad la frustración de los Estados Unidos en su momento para competir con la Rusia, la Guerra Fría. Tenga usted en cuenta esto. Estábamos hablando de Rusia, que había llegado como primera potencia a la Luna, o por lo menos había enviado a alguien a la Luna, y estaba todavía la polarización de esa guerra, reitero, esa Guerra Fría. Bueno, este documento que es una perlita, quiero compartirla con ustedes para, no digo sembrar dudas, pero por lo menos para saber que hay dudas en el mundo respecto de que el hombre efectivamente llegó a la luna. Ese día tan particular, ese 20 de julio, también simboliza el Día Internacional del Amigo. Y yo quiero, con este documento, no sembrar dudas. Agradecer a todos los amigos que están allí siempre, permanentemente, o en la radio, o están acompañándome en este programa. Bueno, ¿nos vamos al documento? ¿Es una explosión? ¿Llegó el hombre a la luna? ¿Realmente? A ver.
30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever. From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom-seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module. In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out. Here a crosshair, which was burned directly into the image from the film plate, and thus should always appear on top of the objects in the photograph, appears behind the object in this scene, clearly revealing a composite of two pictures into one. Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created as it descended. Here is a Norman Rockwell depiction drawn just 2 years earlier based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there. Not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars. Ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind, at least twice, on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside, after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny. To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr. and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're coming in on Earth.
A veces sentís que entrar al mercado laboral es muy difícil, ¿no? Nosotros te queremos dar otra oportunidad. Por eso creamos el programa Jóvenes con Más y Mejor Trabajo. Este programa brinda oportunidades de inclusión social y laboral a chicos y chicas que no terminaron sus estudios primarios o secundarios, que están desempleados o tienen trabajo precario. Sumate. Aprovecha esta oportunidad. Vos también podés ser parte del cambio.
Si te interesa este programa y tenés entre 18 y 24 años, te esperamos en la Dirección de Juventud, en el Gimnasio Municipal o en la Unidad de Formación y Promoción para el Empleo, en Avenida Roca 757. Municipalidad de Zapala. Ideas que suman.
Y yo ahora lo que me concentro más es sacar medalla en dobles, equipo, en dobles mixtos y pelearla en individuales. Pero, qué sé yo, tratar de meterme un podio en los individuales, pero en sub-21, en mi categoría.
¿Te sirve la donación de Darío Luca?
Sí, me dio plata para las gomas, que tenía las gomas hace 1 año y medio yo, y ya esas gomas se tienen que cambiar cada un mes, más o menos.
De la paleta estamos hablando.
Sí. Esas gomas tenía que cambiar cada un mes más o menos y las tenía hace 1 año y medio, así que ya mucho no me servían.
Bueno, muchas gracias a ambos.
No.
Darío Luca apoyando al deporte.
Sí, yo creo que es importante, sobre todas las cosas, al deporte y a los jóvenes, fortalecer las instituciones. Y bueno, les comentaba acá a los amigos que cada vez que le podamos dar una mano, ya sea me estaban planteando que en poco tiempo más hace el sudamericano en Mendoza, así que también le vamos a estar dando una mano para que puedan viajar.